Yo, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast that digs into the world of comic books. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is a great one. Cartoonist Jeff Lemire joins the show to discuss how he works, working in both indie and superhero comics, his current titles Black Hammer and Gideon Falls, and more. But before we get into this week's chat, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And hey, make sure to rate and review Off Panel as well. It helps the show in the magical world of algorithms and the internets. And if you're a super fan of the show, you can back it on Patreon as well at patreon.com/offpanel. In exchange for your support, you'll get early access to each week's show, exclusive access to written and audio content, and more. And now, let's get to this week's episode. Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Gideon Falls and Black Hammer, as well as the cartoonist behind comics like Royal City, Essex County, and Sweet Tooth. It's Jeff Lemire. Thanks for coming on, Jeff.
My pleasure, David. Thanks for having me.
So today, as I was mentioning to you before we started chatting, you have a lot we could talk about, but today I want to primarily focus on Black Hammer and Gideon Falls of all of your work. But, before we get into that, I kind of want to talk about some of your general approaches to comics. And one of the things that I think is one of your greatest powers as a creator is, people bring up all the time that you have a lot of work that you do, that you have a lot that you balance out. But it seems like you have uncanny abilities at organizing and scheduling your own work. Like, would you say that's kind of your superpower in a way?
It is my superpower, yes. Yeah. It's weird. I don't know where I got it from, to be honest. I wasn't. I guess it just, as a kid, I always was very organized, and I don't know, it was weird. I just really like to organize myself. And I used to obsessively organize my comics and clean my room. And I guess there's some level of OCD to it. But I even my studio now, you would think an artist studio would be, messy, but it's all it has to be very organized. I'm very much of the, more organized and clean everything is, the more clearly I can think and the more I can accomplish. So I've always, just had this weird ability to balance a lot of things and really stay structured in my days. And even before I was like a professional cartoonist or writer, when I was just kind of trying to learn how to make comics and trying to make my way. Even back then when I didn't really have any reason to be, I was very disciplined in my days and how I organized myself and sticking with it, and certainly now today that all is kind of paying off and that I'm able to juggle a lot of projects at once, luckily.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like doing that up front when you weren't quite as busy has definitely, it's probably paid off as you've gotten more and more busy, because it's like you've kind of strengthened that like organization muscle to the point where you're finally tuned with all this.
Yeah, absolutely. So like when things get crazy, you kind of have a structure to fall back on, and you can kind of make sense of everything and stay sane by just doing one thing at a time and focusing on what needs to get done and not getting overwhelmed by everything. But it's funny, when I first started doing comics, which would have been like, I was always making comics and drawing and stuff, but when I started to seriously kind of actively try to make comics, like around 99, 2000. Back then I used to just work on one project at a time, one book or one story, and I'd kind of get obsessed with it and have sort of tunnel vision. And I think looking back now that it was often to the detriment, because I would get so obsessed or focused on one story that if I got stuck on something or kind of hit a wall with the plot or something with the artwork, it kind of destroyed me and I didn't have anywhere to go. Whereas now the joy of having multiple things is I never really get frustrated like that, or I never get writer's block or anything like that, because I'll just work on something until I hit that point where I kind of need to figure something out or don't quite have it figured out. And rather than just stare at my screen or my drawing desk, I'll just put that aside and jump over to a different project, and that way, and then come back to it later. And just kind of like constantly moving between things like that keeps you fresh and prevents you from sort of falling down any rabbit holes of like trying to crack something that you're not ready to crack story wise. Or but of course the key to all that is being far enough ahead on everything that you can afford to put things to the side.
Yeah.
That's the key of organization for me. Is, I'm usually at least a year ahead of my artists or whatever's being published in terms of what scripts I'm working on, sometimes more than that. And that's such a luxury that you can go back and rewrite things. You can take a break. For example, Dustin Wen and I, obviously, we were doing the book Descender for the last few years, and we just sort of came to an end on that, and we're relaunching the book as Ascender in April. So I've already written the first 7 issues of Ascender, and Dustin's just starting to draw it now.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of like got really into it for a couple months and wrote those first 7 issues and did a whole bunch of world building, and then I kind of burnt out on it. But the joy of it was I could just put it away for the last like 5 or 6 months. I haven't even touched it, and kind of refill the well so that when I go back to it, I'm fresh again. And that's the joy of staying far ahead on things, which is really the key to even more than organizing. It's sort of the key of juggling.
Yeah.
Projects, I think.
Yeah, I read that when before you'd launched Black Hammer, you were something like 20 issues deep when you'd done that, which is,
Well,
I mean, the nice.
Yeah, that was unique in that. Sorry to interrupt, but go ahead. You ask your question. But I was going to say that was a little unique in that I was obviously ahead of Dean, the artist, when he started drawing it. But then this is already kind of public record, but Dean, right after he finished drawing issue 1 of Black Hammer, he actually had a stroke and was in the hospital and everything for a number of months. So he kind of stopped working on the book, and I didn't really know what to do. I didn't know if Dean would recover, if he could work on it, but the story was there and I had to kind of get it out. So I just kept writing so that by the time Dean sort of rehabbed and was ready to work again, I had already written the bulk of the series, so it was all done for him. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that type of plan though, like that, like you said, it is kind of like a rare thing that you're able to do that, but it is nice because it does insulate you from like deadline nightmares. And it also helps you like, I don't know, do what you're saying where you can put something down and go and think about something else for a while because you do have a lot of irons in the fire.
Yeah. And I find when I was doing a lot of Marvel and DC stuff, it's like such a treadmill where you're, the monthly deadlines are just always there, and you finish one issue and you have to start the next right away. And the artist is usually up against a deadline as well. So, it doesn't always make for the best comics, in that, I can't go back and rewrite things, or say I get an idea later on, I can't go back and kind of reinstitute it into earlier scripts because the stuff's already kind of being made, So, the joy of I think a thing some of the artists I work with really enjoy is that they can often read really far ahead, or read even a whole story before they start drawing. And then they can kind of plan things out visually at the beginning of a story that might pay off at the end. And, those are kind of cool benefits that they have, that when you're working on that sort of that monthly grind, you don't get to do that. You just kind of have to produce quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about like an average day for you, because I read an interview with you that I think some people might find surprising, because I think a lot of times people, maybe I'm just speaking in blanket statements that aren't actually true, but I think sometimes people look at you mostly as a writer these days. But I read that the bulk of your work week is actually spent drawing. Like, what is like a day in your work week like, and where does writing fit in there?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I am always drawing a project as well, but you can never only draw one book at a time. It's just so time consuming. So, but obviously, as we just talked about, I like to have multiple things going, and I got a lot of different kinds of stories I want to do. So the only way for me to really do that was to start writing for other artists as well as whatever I was drawing. But my first kind of love is always cartooning and drawing my own stories, and that just, like, as I said, it just takes so much longer to draw a comic book than it does to write one. You just have to put in more hours to produce it. And so my Monday to Friday, the bulk of it really is drawing. And, I have a studio where I'm at right now outside of my house. And so my day is pretty much, get up around 7, do breakfast stuff with my family and walk my dog, and then I'm usually at my studio around 8:30, and then I just draw for about 8 hours every day here. Right now, I'm working on a graphic novel that probably won't come out for a couple of years, but it's something I've been kind of working on for a few months. And I was Royal City before that, and so I'm always kind of just drawing here all day. And in terms of writing tends to get done a couple hours here and there at night after my son goes to bed, or a few hours on the weekend. If he has homework, I'll work on my stuff while he's doing his homework. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but you really, if I can get, usually write about one script a week in addition to whatever I'm drawing. That keeps me in a pretty good pace. So writing an actual script for a comic book for an artist usually doesn't take me too long, anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, depending on the script. So usually I can pick away at that throughout the week. And of course, that's just the actual script writing. I've been plotting and working on the story and everything. I've done all kind of the groundwork of that ahead of time. But the actual script writing, if things are worked out ahead of time, doesn't take me that long. So I could generally maybe take a day off from drawing here and there to do something, or get it done on the weekend.
Mm-hmm. I kind of feel like, I mean, for me, when I'm writing something, I kind of feel like when I actually get down to writing it, I've thought about it so much. I always describe it as like background processing. It's like there's always like another program going on in the back of my brain. Is that something you were kind of always doing too?
Yeah, so like I said, the script might only take 3 or 5 hours to write, but I've been thinking about that script or that story for months, all the time. And that's the kind of the curse of being a storyteller or a writer, is it's hard to shut that off. So I mean, when I'm driving, when I'm walking my dog, when I'm whatever, you're always thinking story, and you're always kind of working through things. And so yeah, you've done all that sort of prep work so that when you actually sit down to write, it's just a matter of executing these ideas you've been that have been fermenting for a while.
This might be a tough question to answer, but it's like, you have your organization and scheduling brain that's very finely tuned, but do you feel like that part of your brain is reflected in your work, or is that purely just like a scheduling thing? Is that separate from?
They're completely separate. That's sort of like this skeleton that allows the other stuff to exist. You get that structure and everything in your day, and then that allows you just to dive in to whether you're drawing or writing or whatever the creative aspect is, and kind of just work from your subconscious and work from the opposite side of your brain and just sort of create, and all that organization and everything is just sort of to give you the structure in your life that allows you to do that.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, they're kind of the opposite sides of things, really.
They're like the complementary sides that kind of make the whole.
Yeah, because creating, whether it's writing or whatever, it's all very spontaneous, and you're just kind of going on your gut and on emotion, and whereas the other, that's kind of the opposite of what we were talking about.
I do think that like the studio part is really interesting, because I read an article. I think it was like I was covering some people in the Toronto area who have like studios that are like outside of their home, and like how they afford it, because Toronto apparently is very expensive. And I think Chip Zdarsky was covered in it, and if I remember correctly, his studio was in like effectively a garage outside of his house. So it was kind of more like a ceremonial studio. It was like taking a step out of there, helped him separate himself from that home life by being in this professional space. Does that, having that separation, is that something you really need to be able to get into that mentality to create?
It's interesting. I needed to draw. I can write anywhere.
Sure.
I write at home. I can write on the bus. I can write an airplane. Writing for whatever reason, I can just, as long as I have my laptop, I can. Once I get into it, everything else kind of fades in the background, and I can just do that anywhere. But drawing, I really need to have everything kind of just so. I need a separate space. I need to be completely alone. I need all my drawing stuff kind of laid out exactly like I like it. I really need to get into the zone. So it's kind of different for both things, but I definitely need that. And I also just need a space to store all the comics and junk that I don't have room for. And I collect original comic art too. So I need somewhere to hang all that. So the studio is good for that. And it's just good to get out of the house, because doing what we do is so kind of insular anyway, and you're kind of in your head all the time. If you just stayed home all the time, it could get, I don't know, it might get kind of dangerous for me. It's good to have to go out and actually confront the world once in a while.
Hmm. I feel like there are some comic creators who could probably build forts out of their comps just because they have so many, and the studio space would probably be really nice for that.
Yes.
Okay, so I one more question before we jump into Black Hammer. I want to talk about another special power I feel like you have because as much as I enjoy all of your work, I feel like your greatest strength is when your comics are either set in Canada or in rural areas. Do you feel like that is also is that something that you particularly connect to so you feel like some of your best work can come from that?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, a lot of my stuff's set in a rural area, whether it's Canadian or not. And that's just I've always felt comfortable in that world and telling stories in that world. And I also like juxtaposing big, crazy sci-fi or superhero concepts with that sort of small canvas, of a small town. It's fun to do that, and it creates an interesting tension. I kind of discovered that early on, and have been, exploring it ever since. But it just comes from, I think, my childhood was spent on a farm, and I lived, the first 18 years of my life, I grew up in a really small town on a farm. So that just becomes such an inherent part of you. And when you're a kid and you first start formulating stories and your imagination and everything, it's all mixed in with where you are. So I think it's just a natural part of me. So the stories feel more natural when they come from that place.
Hmm. I do feel like both Gideon Falls and Black Hammer are especially adept at using that juxtaposition. I mean, obviously, like Gideon Falls, like at its core, that juxtaposition is a really big part of it. But it is cool seeing that play out.
Yeah, it's real fun to do that, and you could probably play psychologist and think back to when I was a kid, and you're on a farm and you're kind of acting out all these insane superhero or whatever stories in your head when you're make believe and stuff. And but it is fun just to so many genre things, sci-fi, superheroes, whatever. They often the canvases are very large, or they're set in like an urban center, and there's just a really wonderful sort of I love juxtaposing big ideas with really quiet sort of things and really intimate, personal kind of things. And small towns have provided a great sort of setting for, obviously Gideon and Black Hammer are both kind of exploring both horror and superheroes through this sort of small town canvas has been really fun and something that's sort of the culmination of a lot of my different work.
Hmm. So with Black Hammer, before we talk about the specifics about that, I want to talk about kind of your general love of comics because that's obviously super important for that world. Do you feel that perhaps more than anything else you've done, that Black Hammer is the comic that's the most reflective of all of your loves in comics? Especially I mean, one of the things I really love about the book is the minis allow you to do so many different things. Is this kind of the culmination of your personal fandom in some ways?
Yeah, I think it's the perfect synthesis of a lot of things, when for me, personally, it's I started off when I first started making comics with Essex County, and I kind of found my voice as a writer. It was telling these sort of very grounded stories set in a farm in a small town about family, small town communities, and drawing from my own life. But there was also this other big part of me who always loved superhero comics and more, the genre stuff that we grew up reading. And back then, back in 2090, or late mid 90s, whatever, much more than now, indie comics and mainstream comics were very separated. People who did indie comics usually did sort of like slice of life stuff, and then there were like the mainstream comics who did superheroes and science fiction and stuff, and those things didn't really mix as much as they do now. Now you kind of those separations don't exist the same way they did back then. But so when I was doing Essex County, I just never thought I would actually ever do like real quote superhero comics. My style, my art style certainly didn't fit and doesn't fit Marvel or DC, and this kind of stories I was doing with Essex just didn't really. I didn't see a pathway towards writing Green Arrow, which I ended up doing. But so it was sort of taking that love of my fandom growing up and all those things I loved and all those different eras of superhero comics that I loved, but filtering them through that Essex County kind of storytelling. So it really is the perfect combination of everything I do and everything I kind of love into one book.
Mm-hmm. That separation you're talking about is really interesting because you're one of the creators that actually kind of lives in the divide between like independent comics and in superhero comics in a substantial way. Because, I had Ed Piskor on my podcast and we talked about how some of like his indie comics crew were like shocked and not, I wouldn't say offended, but like they were kind of like, why are you doing an X-Men comic?
Right. Yeah.
And it is interesting because while there's a lot more integration than there used to be, I do think that sometimes it's like, it can be perceived that superheroes are like almost like a lesser version of the form. Maybe I don't know if that's unfair, but that's just kind of
true. It's not. It is unfair, but it's also very true. I encountered that a lot early on, when I first did Essex, and then started writing stuff for DC. People, critics, and other things who had kind of embraced me with Essex County, all of a sudden were like scoffing and writing these sort of scathing reviews of how I'd sold out, and it's just like such a juvenile kind of way of looking at things. The sellout, it's comics are comics. There's great indie comics and there's great superhero comics, and there's really bad indie comics and really bad superhero comics. And there's no reason you need to separate those things. When any one of them is done well, it's magical, and we should just embrace the good stuff. And there's not enough good stuff, and so you should embrace it when it comes. And and I love all kinds of comics. I love the medium. I don't love a certain genre, But superhero comics, yes, of course, like we are oversaturated with superhero comics, and 99% of the stuff that comes out every week is kind of forgettable and disposable. But that 1% that isn't is always so magical, when you get like an All-Star Superman or whatever, some beautiful superhero comic it's just amazing. And the same thing with indie stuff. It's just because it's not genre or it tries to be highbrow doesn't mean it's good, but there is great stuff. And I just never saw the separation, and I just didn't care about that kind of, that outsider perspective of that kind of high school sort of that's cool and that's not cool bullshit. I just sort of, I knew what I liked and I always just did it. So, and fuck it. I it worked out for me. And I remember early on, Chris Staros, who published, the publisher at Top Shelf, when I just had done Essex, and I told him that I was doing some stuff for DC, and I kind of expressed sort of uneasiness, like, oh, I hope people don't think I'm going to sell out or whatever. And Chris sort of just laughed and said, the only people that can, every single indie artist, if they had a chance to write the X-Men once, they would. They just don't, so they scoff at it, And it's true. A lot of these people that scoff at the superhero stuff really love it too, and they just don't want to admit it. So it's awesome to see Ed doing what he's doing, and I don't see any reason why you have to separate those things. Good comics are good comics.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing is like I think your path, from what I understand, for like as a reader is pretty typical because you grew up reading DC comics, from what I understand, and then it's like once you moved into Toronto, you found The Beguiling, and The Beguiling is like a perfect gateway into all of the other worlds that comics have to offer. And like, I don't know, I mean, I think that not everyone grows up on superhero comics, but the people that do, it's like I think you can integrate kind of, I don't know, both sides of your interest in comics into one whole thing and still create great things on both sides.
Yeah, for sure. And I even, sometimes I still struggle sometimes, like, well, what should I do next? For the stuff I draw, especially, I'm like, should I do something that's more grounded, or should I do something that's kind of has maybe a genre or a fantastic element to it? And I often have to fight that urge of that voice in your head saying, oh, you shouldn't do any genre stuff. You shouldn't do something that sort of has some sort of fantastic or supernatural element, because that's not as quote unquote literary. And I have to like remind myself, like, or just forget that voice and just do what's fun to do, because if you're not having fun doing what you're doing, chances are the reader's probably not going to have much fun reading it. So I long ago just learned to sort of go with whatever I wanted to draw the most,
Mm-hmm. So, speaking of that, like, I think Black Hammer is an impressive mix of all of those things. It's fun, but it's also grounded, and it's got the crazy sci-fi elements and everything like that, and just keeps getting bigger and bigger with the minis. What was its origin story? Like, how was that one of those projects you wanted to do? And was it always, meant to be bigger than just the core storyline?
No, not at all. Yeah, the origin was really what I laid out earlier, where I had done Essex County, and I never thought I'd get to do a real superhero comic, quote unquote. So I just this would be my superhero comic, and so I came up with this idea of these 5 or 6 superheroes from different eras of continuity or comic book history, kind of stranded together on a farm, living as this weird kind of bizarre surrogate family, and that was the core story, and that's basically what the main series ended up being. And I never really imagined spinning it off into any of the other things, or that the universe would grow the way it has. That kind of came out of a combination of luck and necessity, and just a sense of fun, because Dean, Dean had some health issues, as I outlined earlier, and he had done the first arc or so, but the deadlines caught up to him again, so he needed to catch up. So it was either put the book on hold for 2 or 3 months, or do some fill-in issues. And luckily, one of the great things about working with Dark Horse is they have a lot of great artists that they can get for me. So when they told me they could get David Rubin to do a couple fill-in issues, I got really excited, because David's amazing. So I just kind of out of fun, wrote a couple fill-in issues of Black Hammer that would kind of expand different aspects of the story, and you'd see a few other corners of the world. And as soon as I did those 2 kind of fill-in issues, and did that once, it was like it just opened a doorway in my brain, where I just started seeing all these different avenues the world could start to explore and expand. And so I got the idea of doing the actual spin-offs and kind of expanding the universe in different ways. And luckily the book was successful enough that we were allowed to do that. So yeah, it wasn't a plan, but it's something I've since embraced, and I'm having a blast doing.
I actually really love that, because, The Wicked and the Divine has done things like that too, where they have those fill-in stories. They have the stories in between where they're telling the eras of different pantheons in between, so Jamie McKelvey doesn't die trying to live up to the schedule. And it's like, it works in really well in 2 different ways. It buys the creators time, the artists time, but also, like, you get to expand on, like, the story and everything. And I'm very thankful for it. I just want to say, like, Dr. Star and the Kingdom of Lost Tomorrows is absolutely one of my favorite comics of this year. Like, the ending, like, nearly broke me as a person reading it.
Yeah. I gotta say, of all the stuff I've ever done, I know I've done a lot of sad stories, but I've never actually gotten super emotional while writing or drawing anything of my own, except that one. I actually kind of cried a bit when I was writing. That one got me a bit too, but it kind of hit home for me as well as a father. So, but yeah, I guess thanks for saying that. But yeah, it almost broke me too.
I mean, and it's really great too, like you said, with Dark Horse. Daniel, your editor. I mean, he's worked in the Mignolaverse and everything, and Max Fumara is a huge part of that. And he did an absolutely brilliant job on that book, and the storytelling and the emotional beats. I mean, it was just astonishing.
It was weird. Max, I don't know Max very well. I've only worked with him on this project and communicated through email and stuff. And but there was a weird synergy with Max, where often you'll write the scripts, and then the artists will do the work, and it's often better than what you imagine, or different than what you imagine, but great. But with Max, it was really weird. It was almost like I was drawing the book myself. His layouts and everything was exactly how I saw it in my head when I was writing the scripts, which never happens. So there's a weird synergy in the way he and I tell a story. It's very similar kind of storytelling sensibility in terms of the way we lay out panels, and even his drawing style. It's different from mine, but there is sort of a weird connection and sort of the emotive quality of it too. So I loved working with Max. He's fantastic.
Across the board, you've had pretty astonishing collaborators. I mean, obviously, there's the main crew of Dean Ormston, and then Dave Stewart and Todd Klein, who are not too shabby in the world of coloring and lettering. But I mean, then you also have, like, David Rubin, who you mentioned. Wilfredo Torres is somebody I think is tremendously underrated, and I'm happy to see him doing the Quantum Age. Rich Tommaso. Yeah. I mean, what's the process for writing or finding the right artistic fit for each comic, or is a lot of that coming from Daniel and the rest of Dark Horse?
It's a back and forth. you'll have the story, so the story sort of dictates a certain style generally, and sometimes we kind of try to cast against the norm. So, um, one thing, this goes back to me kind of partnering with Dean early on, was that it's very, very easy it would be very easy for Black Hammer to slip into some of the, some of the sort of the cliches of superhero comics and actually become the thing it's sort of commenting on. If you're not careful, it could just become, certain aspects of it could become sort of cliched, um, and we really wanted to sort of see superheroes through a different lens, and so that's why Dean, you don't typically think of Dean, or when you see his art, you wouldn't think of superheroes. He kind of does horror stuff, and I knew as soon as I saw his stuff that seeing him draw superheroes would be so different from what you're normally seeing that it would be new. It would feel fresh, and it did. So a lot of the times when you're doing the minis, even, you want something that suits the story, but you also don't want something that's just your typical kind of generic house style superhero stuff. So people like David and Max and Wilfredo and working with Emmy Lennox on one now, and they all aren't your typical superhero artists. They're just a little left of that, and but they all offer something really unique. But they, at the same time, there is something about, you look at Wilfredo, and there is something about his style that it does sort of embrace the Silver Age,
Mm-hmm.
and even though it's a little more sophisticated and modern at the same time, it does have that quality. So he was the perfect choice for that book.
Yeah, it is kind of funny because you read that and you're just like, wow, it's a real shame that Legion isn't around anymore because Wilfredo would kill it. I mean, he is kind of doing a Legion book with that. But yeah, and I also want to give you a shout out because I love that you're doing another book with your Plutono partner, Emmy Lennox. And the name Cthulhuese is very inspired. Very good job.
Thank you. Really, Black Hammer was just an excuse for me to come up with really silly puns as for characters and have fun with them, like Barbalian and Cthulhuese and all these silly things. But yeah, and he's great. And we had obviously did Plutona, which almost feels like a cousin to Black Hammer, the Plutona story. But so she's doing the Cthulhuese one with me, and then we have, I think, 3 other series in the works right now, new ones for next year and the year after. So some other great talent involved in those as well.
It obviously, like, there's a lot of room you could go in because you've established so much in the core book and beyond. But is there, like, do you have a feel for what overexpanding the universe would look like, or is that not something you're super worried about?
Yeah, I'm very careful. It would be real easy to take advantage of a good thing. Well, I want to make sure that every story is unique and we're not telling the same story more than once, first of all. And it's something I'm really passionate about. So each miniseries kind of needs to feel very different from both the main Black Hammer book, but also from the other miniseries. They all have to offer something new, or else there's no point in doing them. So there have been things that have come up that I've kind of worked on a bit, and it just felt derivative, or it felt like it wasn't strong enough, that I've sort of, since kind of cut. So yeah, we're being real careful about that. I never want to just sort of expand for the sake of expanding, and it's not really the point of the stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to give you credit. Like with the 2 completed ones, like Dr. Starr and Sherlock Frankenstein, they were both, I went in expecting one thing, and they weren't that at all, in a very good way. I mean, Sherlock Frankenstein's kind of hilarious. I don't know if this really counts as a spoiler, but Sherlock Frankenstein does not actually feature prominently in the story himself in terms
Yes.
of actual, like, screen time, so to say.
And the Legion of Evil is not very evil.
The Legion of actually kind of helpful people.
The Legion of mundane daily life.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. Everything has to have if it's going to be Black Hammer, it has to have something different about it. It can't just be a straight superhero story, or else there's enough of those out there. So sometimes I'll get a great idea for like something, a certain sort of a certain kind of riffing off a certain aspect of superhero history or a certain type of archetype of a superhero, and it would be fun to do, but it doesn't really have that other element that makes it unique or different or worth doing other than just being pastiche or just being just a generic take on one of those another generic superhero story. So unless it kind of has that edge, that sort of second element that makes it unique, that's kind of the other thing I look for when I'm developing the books.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you don't want to just tell a superhero story. You want to tell your superhero story, like a superhero story that matches your, aesthetic and your approach to story.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Or it just becomes sort of parody or mimicry, and that can be fun, but it's fun isn't enough. It kind of has to have some heart too.
and now, a word from our sponsor. Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick break to talk about my friends at Radio vs. the Martians. Mike Gillis and Casey Doran host the Radio vs. the Martians podcast, a show that gathers their funniest, smartest friends once a month for a deep dive into science fiction, video games, horror, comics, movies, and everything in between. So far, they've dissected topics like Superman, Steven Spielberg, Akira, George Lucas, zombies, Twin Peaks, Hayao Miyazaki, James Bond, Watchmen, and whether drivers are required to pull over for the Ghostbusters. Find this podcast and its spin-off show, Podcast La Vista, baby, a celebration of the films of thespian and statesman Arnold Schwarzenegger on iTunes, Stitcher, and at radioversusthemartians.com. And now, back to the show. Just two more questions about Black Hammer. I wanted to ask about Dean. He's obviously a huge part of the core story. He's a huge part of the overall project. And I know this project was in development for a long time. What did you change Black Hammer, or did Black Hammer kind of evolve at all once you had Dean on board and you started kind of developing it with him in mind, I guess?
Well, yeah, obviously he brought a lot of himself to it as well, so it changes. The core idea, the initial idea of the farm story and these characters lost and trapped on this farm and wiped out of their own continuity and the actual core cast I had developed beforehand. But then when Dean draws them, they take on a life of their own, obviously. And there were I think there were a couple other characters that would originally have been part of the story that when Dean just started drawing things, I kind of saw them a little differently, and I combined a couple different characters into one character for the better, and so things like that. Yeah, but that's just sort of the initial idea that's in everything. Once you get into the book and get into the issue by issue storytelling, everything starts to grow and change anyway. And Dean was, my partner in all of that.
Mm-hmm. So the last one I want to ask about Black Hammer is obviously, I mean, yesterday it was announced that you have a movie and TV deal with Legendary Entertainment for Black Hammer. I'm kind of curious about like the impact on the comic, if there is even an impact. Like, does that change things for the comic at all, or is that just those are separate beasts and they're not even? I mean, they're interrelated in some ways, but they're not really related in that way.
Yeah, they're not related creatively. It's like it changes things in that hopefully if a film or a television series is made, then it just sells more books and helps me to continue to tell more stories because the books are doing well. But in terms of me adjusting my thinking of how I'm going to develop the world or what kinds of stories I'm going to tell in the comics, it has zero impact. I haven't even thought about that. The best thing I can do for both the film and television side of things and the comic is just to keep doing what I'm doing. And if I keep telling really quality stories through the comics, it just gives better material for the adaptations to work with. So I don't really worry about it too much. I just do my thing with the comic. That's always the priority for me, are the comics. And the film and television stuff is exciting, and the potential of it's really exciting and fun, but it's never the goal, or it's always sort of just a fun side thing. The comics are what matter to me.
I have to wonder. I mean, when you think about it, it's like for some people, if one of your projects maybe hits it big in terms of that sort of way, I wonder if sometimes that can get in your head, where it's like you start thinking about what is it that people liked about this and how can I do this again, and then you start chasing that rather than kind of letting the stories come to you. Like I wonder if there's something there, but maybe there isn't.
There is. It happens. It doesn't happen to me anymore, but when I was first starting out, Essex County wasn't a giant mainstream success by any means, but for me at the time, as someone who was not making a living and struggling to suddenly have something published and receiving critical acclaim and stuff, that was a big deal to me at the time. And it took me a couple projects to kind of get over the success of Essex even and start to do new kinds of stories, because I kept, well, you start wondering, well, should I just keep doing the same thing as this? And it took me a while to kind of break free and do something like Sweet Tooth, which was completely different and then succeeded on its own merits, But once I did it a couple times and broke free of it, I'm at the point now where I'm doing so many different stories and so many different kinds of stories that I don't even think about that anymore. But that does definitely happen for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if only for the fact that it's like people can't stop comparing you to that previous project. It's just like,
Yeah.
well, this isn't Essex County. I mean, it's like the funny
Yeah.
thing is it's like you have to like look at somebody like Brian K. Vaughan. It's like, oh, he'll never top Y the Last Man, and now it's like, oh, you'll never top Saga, and then it's just gonna keep going, and everyone's gonna have a new thing
Just
to say.
do your thing, and you can't listen to any of that stuff. None of that stuff helps you creatively, even when it's positive. Like, it doesn't. Good reviews can mess with you just as much as bad reviews. I learned a long time ago. It's been years since I've read a review of anything I've done or really engaged online with that kind of stuff. And that's not because I don't respect people who review comics and stuff. It's just that it doesn't help me creatively in any way. So you got to follow your inner voice and not, that stuff can really mess with you. I don't even listen to it anymore.
Yeah, well, it's a good idea. I mean, it's not really even for you, anyways. It's like for
Yeah, it's for
people.
readers. That someone mentioned that to me once, and it was, comics reviews aren't for the creators; they're for readers to find new things to read, and they're not for us to to help us with our work or to help us see our own work in a new way. They're not written for us. They're written for people who want to read new comics and want to find cool new things to read. So.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Gideon Falls now. That's your Image series with artist Andrea Sorrentino and your Black Hammer pal Dave Stewart, which I do want to say is genuinely horrific. I'm not often scared by comics, but this comic scares me, which I don't know. It's really funny. I've always had a fraught relationship with like horror, where it's
Yeah.
like I either love it or I kind of hate it in some ways, but this is like the good kind of horror for me.
Yeah, I feel that I'm not a big horror fan. I never was. In fact, I was horrified by horror in not a good way. Like as a kid, I remember I grew up in the '80s, so the slasher stuff was like huge. Like Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th and all those things were coming out like every year. It felt like, and as a kid, seeing those commercials and everything, they just horrified me, and I was terrified of them. And then growing up, I never could get into that stuff. It just like, especially gore, was something I just despise, and it just revolts me, and not in a way that's exciting or interesting at all. I just don't like it. So
Mm-hmm.
I was never a big horror fan, but then once in a while, like you said, there'd be something that I guess is, something that's smarter, kind of more psychological, more, things like. There are very few examples, but stuff like Twin Peaks or The Shining, or there'll be those ones that are just real smart, and it's almost a different kind of horror. It's like a deeper sort of horror. It doesn't rely on shock and gore, but it's more this sort of impending sense of dread and mood. That stuff I really like. It's kind of few and far between when it works, but when it does, I love it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was pretty horrified of Freddy growing up just because I didn't like the idea of somebody messing with my dreams. And like that was a very like real type feel for me.
It is
But
horrifying.
yeah, I do like more of like the I don't know. It's like horror that just kind of has this atmospheric pressure on you.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of this cosmic dread that's, and that's why Twin Peaks always struck me as a kid when I was like 12 or something when it first aired. And boy, it hit me hard. It kind of had everything, It wasn't just horror. It had humor and mystery and drama and everything, but the horror aspects of it were so impactful. They did have that sense of pressure building, that sense of dread or something mysterious and terrifying out there that you couldn't quite define or fully fathom. Is almost kind of Lovecraftian, and certainly Gideon. I'm trying to tap into that with Gideon Falls.
Mm-hmm. I everyone talks about the fact that Twin Peaks isn't often off comparison for this book. I know David Lynch was a huge creator for you, and I read in an interview with you that there was this one quote that like is notable for you. It's negativity does not breed creativity. And,
Yeah.
and I think I know that's like a guiding light of sorts for you. Like, how does that impact your outlook and approach as a creator?
Well, it's not so much just me as a creator as it's my whole life, and I don't want to get too personal or whatever because I'm not super comfortable with that. But I will say that in my 20s and early 30s, I did suffer a lot from depression and anxiety, and I really struggled, and a lot of that, I was trying to make comics then too, and a lot of times it just didn't really go well, or I couldn't separate the work from sort of my emotional sort of situation, and kind of it was very messy and unhealthy, and it wasn't until I got a bit older and sort of dealt with certain aspects of my life and became healthier that I started to actually create and be successful as a comic book artist and writer. And I realized that, sort of that romantic myth of the tortured artist is really a myth, because when you're feeling shitty and feeling down, it's really hard to create. And it doesn't really breed great art, all it does is breed misery, really. And, so that quote really just reinforces that the happier and healthier you are in your life, the easier it is to create, at least for me, and that doesn't mean that everything I create is happy and healthy and nice and sunny. I do dark things as well, but it's much easier to kind of create when you're feeling good about yourself and about your life. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about how like, time passes by and you start to understand things better. I think one of the interesting things about Gideon Falls is like Gideon Falls is, from what I understand, basically you've almost like sandwiched together two different ideas you had to make one big idea. And I think that's super fascinating.
Yeah. Going back to what I was just saying, when I was younger and trying to make comics and not really succeeding, there was this book that I kept working on over and over again. That was sort of I guess sort of the seed for Gideon Falls, or at least the Norton character was kind of my alter ego when I was in my 20s, of this sort of obsessive young kind of loner character. So I had that story, that character of this guy kind of looking for some sort of supernatural mystery in the city's trash. And I kept working on that book over and over again and just couldn't quite get it to work. And most of that was the fact that I was young and didn't really know how to make comics yet, and was learning things as I went. And then I'd kind of make a creative leap, and then the stuff I had done previously didn't hold up anymore, and I'd have to start over. So I started this project over and over again. But anyways, so yeah, it kind of was there. And then after, I just burnt out on it, when I was in my mid-20s, and put it aside and never really thought about it again. And then the sort of the Father Fred small town aspect was another story I was working on maybe 5-6 years ago. There were elements of it that I liked. It was sort of this supernatural small town thing with this priest character, but it wasn't quite clicking. At least it didn't click enough that I ever really got it off the ground, And then I guess it was when I started talking to Andrea about doing something, because he and I had obviously we worked on Green Arrow at DC and had success with that. And then did Old Man Logan at Marvel, and we just have a great chemistry between us, and a sort of a great respect for one another and what we do, and we love working together. So we started talking about doing a creator-owned book, getting away from Marvel and DC and really sort of doing something that would be all our own. And we talked about what kind of things he wanted to draw, and his art sensibility does have sort of a moodiness and a darkness to it that horror, certainly sort of the psychological horror, was something he wanted to do. And when I started thinking about that, both of these old stories kind of popped up as possibilities, but again, neither really was fully formed or wasn't clicking until I kind of mashed them together. And the tension you get sometimes by putting two ideas together is really what makes a story click, that's what happened when I juxtaposed these two separate stories and kind of worked them together. they each kind of started working suddenly. The things that weren't working before, they sort of complemented each other in a nice way, and Gideon kind of grew out of that. So that's, I guess, you just never. It's why even sometimes the ideas that don't go anywhere, you kind of file them away because aspects of them can be very useful later.
Yeah. I think the cool thing about it too is like these two ideas are still in some ways separate, but it's like they're connected by the Black Barn and Gideon Falls itself, the city. And it's really fascinating to read, to like start like kind of formulating how the connection actually works, or if there is even a connection and everything. And this is kind of one of those questions that I think get asked a lot whenever there's like a prominent location, but it really does feel like in some ways that Gideon Falls itself is like the third main character. Is that a dramatic way of looking at it, or is that kind of in a way how you think about it?
I can't answer it because I know where the story's going, and it's if I even say anything, I might tip my hat. But yes, obviously, setting is hugely important. I was contrasting a dense urban center with sort of a bucolic small town for a reason, and the tension that those two things create. But yes, the town of Gideon Falls, or whatever Gideon Falls is very important to the story, and it's obviously there's a lot of mystery and secrets going on in the narrative, but there is payoff, and you won't have to wait very long to get answers to some of that stuff. But it obviously opens different doors too for us in terms of storytelling. But yeah, it's not the kind of thing where you're gonna have to wait 30 issues to find out answers. Like things are coming, and it starts happening real quick soon. So yeah, it's a good question that we should revisit in like a year.
I kind of feel like every issue has answers. It's just they're not obviously answers necessarily. And
Well, the other thing too is a lot of times when you do, another thing I learned a lot from Lynch, and other, not just David Lynch, but filmmakers who deal with mystery, and or storytellers that deal with mystery or big mythologies and do it really well. You have to know what answers to give, but also what to leave open to interpretation. Because if you answer everything right away, you lose all the tension in the narrative. So I'm being very careful about the way I answer things, and also leaving some of those answers a little open to interpretation, because you don't want to do that to the point where everything's vague and just arbitrary. But you kind of have to find the balance between the two, and when you do, you can create a real interesting sort of tension that keeps drawing the reader in, hopefully.
I don't expect you to answer anything. This is not even a question. I just want to say, I feel like in issue 7, how the flashback on the bus was the first scene of the series that didn't have that scratchy feel to Andrea's feel or art. I feel like that's meaningful, and I feel like that's going to be a very important part going forward without you guys really calling attention to it, just because the art change was notable.
No, you're wrong. It's pointless.
Is it really?
Yeah, no, I don't know.
Never mind. Anyways, well, I want to ask a couple quick questions about the art in general. I know that's not your thing, but it is interesting how sometimes creative teams that, find each other not because they've chosen each other really jive. Like, how quickly did it become obvious that you and Andrea were going to be a good partnership?
Real quickly, and that's an interesting one because I got the gig to do Green Arrow at DC, and at the time, Green Arrow was not very successful. It was kind of just a very straightforward superhero comic, and it wasn't clicking. And DC kind of asked me to shake it up if I could, and so I went back to kind of a more grounded, darker approach to the character. But I really wanted an artist that was much like when I found Dean for Black Hammer. I wanted an artist that you wouldn't necessarily think of superheroes when you saw their art, so that when they did do a superhero comic, it felt different and new. So Andrea had been doing a book at DC as well called I, Vampire, sort of a horror book, and I think they didn't know what to do with him after that book was canceled because he was, a quote horror artist, and they didn't have a lot of horror books. So I kind of really fought to get him on Green Arrow because that was sort of a Justice League family title, and they didn't really picture this guy who had done I, Vampire drawing one of the Justice League. But I could see how it would work. I could seeing Green Arrow through his lens would be so cool and unique. And so there was a bit of a fight to get him on that book, but as soon as we started working together, it really clicked. And it's one of those rare things where you'll write a script and the artist will deliver something so much more than what you envisioned. And then it gives you, just looking at the art gives you new ideas that you then put back into the next script, and back and forth and back and forth. And that we've continued doing that on every project. And it's kind of culminated in Gideon, where I'll lay out an idea and a story, which is already pretty crazy. A lot of the stuff I'm writing in the script, because there's a lot of weird, juxtapositions and weird transitions and things happening. And then he'll take it, turn that up to 11, where it's like even wilder than what I imagined. And I'll see that, and then I'll start writing the next script based on what I've just seen, and push the story even further. And it's like the perfect collaboration. It doesn't happen often, but for whatever reason, we work real well together like that, where we kind of push each other in the right way and complement each other in the right way.
I feel like the mirror scene with Joe Reddy was definitely one of those ones.
Yeah, and that was, even in the script, that's one of the ones where I almost asked him to draw it just like in the script, because I really liked the idea of this woman looking in her bathroom mirror and seeing through the window. And, it was very terrifying, that idea. I hadn't really seen it. And he didn't draw it like as straightforward as I imagined it. But he ended up drawing that thing where it's like you turn the page and all of a sudden the entire language of comics is like blown up into this weird four-dimensional whatever he did. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's pretty cool. It's like so much more than what I thought, but it still conveys the same idea, just in a bigger way. And then, seeing stuff like that pushes me to get bigger in my ideas for where the story's going. And it's exciting to work with someone like that. It's exciting to be surprised and kind of shocked when you see art come back, based on something you've written. You don't get that when you draw your own comics, or often with collaborations, you don't get that. So it's real cool.
I want to give him a lot of credit, because sometimes I feel like I kind of almost essentially call this like the J.H. Williams III effect, where it's like people have seen his layouts and they're like, I want to do that because it's cool looking. Yeah. And it's hard to actually tell a story while doing that. That's the real rare part about what J.H. Williams III does, is the fact that he's able to use that as storytelling. Yeah, I feel like Andrea can do that.
Yeah, and there's not many that can. I know it's exactly what you said. J.H. Williams does that. He does these insane layouts, and they're really like, push the envelope in terms of conceptually and everything else, but yet they still manage to tell the story. And I've worked with and seen artists who try to do that kind of cool stuff, but the storytelling is so poor that it doesn't work. It might look really cool as an illustration or as a piece of art, but it's not conveying the ideas that need to be conveyed to tell a cohesive story. But Andrea, I get like JH, he does both, where those things aren't distractions, and they're augmenting the ideas in the script, and his layout idea comes from something in the script, or that needs to be communicated, rather than just an idea for a cool layout. So for him, it all comes from what's happening in the story, and how can he use comics visually to augment that idea, rather than starting with a visual and then trying to shoehorn the story into it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last Gideon Falls question I have is, we talked about the atmospheric pressure, like the dread and everything like that. And I think that can be a tough thing to convey in comics, because I guess you don't have the motion element and everything like that. I think you guys,
sound is the big one.
Sound.
A lot of the stuff in Lynch's work that I love is his sound design. It's so terrifying, and in film, a big benefit in horror films is the way they use sound, the soundtrack, whether it's music or sound design, to kind of augment this or create scares, and you can't get that in comics. You kind of need to. It's a real detriment that we don't have. So you kind of have to find it in other ways, and really the only tools we have are pacing, page turns, and just a sense of style and atmosphere created by both the story and the artwork. So you have to work both of those to the best of your ability. Andrea's obviously perfect for that, because he'll always do something surprising. So it kind of leaves you unsettled. You never know what will come.
Well, and I think that the one tool you do have as far as sound is the absence of it, and I think that you guys do use silence pretty well. Like if I remember correctly, in that mirror scene, there's no dialogue. It's just like this is progressing, and it makes it so much scarier that like we see this bit by bit by bit thing that's happening, and there's no sound to it. There's no
Yeah.
like we're not reading it. I mean, we are reading it, but you know what I'm saying.
Silence is one of the great tools comics have that other mediums don't, that is so underused by so many writers because I think the majority of people writing comics don't draw themselves, and their way of putting authorship on something is by putting words on the page,
Mm.
and what they fail to often to realize is that comics is visual first, and just because you haven't filled the page with words doesn't mean you're not authoring something, and you can let go of that, and you can do some really effective things with silence. And um, yeah, so I learned early on drawing my own comics the power of silence and just letting because often if you don't use a lot of narration and things like that, the reader starts to invest more of themselves into reading reading what's happening in the images, and it becomes almost a little bit of a deeper exercise for the reader as well. And then you can really, if you're doing something like horror, you can really mess with that with them in that way, where they're engaged on a little bit of a deeper level, trying to decipher something, and all of a sudden there's a shock or a scare, Whereas if the page is filled with like moody narration, you're kind of taken away from those visuals.
Yeah, totally. That I did want to actually ask. Obviously, you draw your own comics. You do all like the book, the graphic novel you mentioned earlier. That's Frog Catchers, right?
Yeah, well, that one's done. I'm actually working on one after that.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah, so Frog Catchers is a new book that I did in the spring. That will come out next year from Simon and Schuster. I think we're gonna release a little more details about that soon.
Sure.
And now I'm kind of working on the follow up to that as well.
So, obviously, it's a different experience writing for yourself versus writing for another artist. But is your actual script writing process different when you're writing for yourself versus writing for somebody like Andrea?
It's funny, I when I first was drawing comics, I didn't really think of myself as a writer. I was just a cartoonist, so I would just sort of, I didn't really have scripts or anything. I was just kind of working out scenes and working out stories and drawing them. And this is back before, when I was before Essex, and when I was doing Essex County, you're kind of just feeling things out and you're kind of immersed in it. And you're kind of going scene by scene. You might have like a rough outline or something, but I didn't really have a script, And then the more I started writing comics for other artists and writing in full script, the more I started thinking that way naturally. So even for myself, when I was doing Sweet Tooth or Royal City or whatever, I started writing full scripts for myself just because I was so used to thinking that way and breaking down story that way. But then something happened around after Royal City where I kind of burnt out on that structure, and I did this graphic novel, Frog Catchers, almost as an exercise in sort of letting go again. And I didn't have a script, and I just had sort of a loose idea of where things would go and what the story was. I wouldn't even call it an outline. It was very loose, and I just started drawing it kind of spontaneously, and the freedom of that was incredible. It was so fun, without having that, just sort of finding the story as I went, and so much more spontaneous, and it kept me so engaged from day to day, rather than have the whole thing worked out and you're just executing the drawings. You're like finding the story as you draw. And I had kind of forgotten what that felt like. It kind of brought me back to where I started. And so now, again, on this new book after Frog Catchers, I just started, again, no script, just a general sense of where it starts and where it might go. And I'm kind of finding it as I go. And I find it really thrilling. And, I could fall on my face and it might not work out, but that's the joy of doing all these other projects, is if this one book doesn't end up working out, I have all this other stuff that's going, that it's not going to be the end of the world. So I can kind of take those risks, and I love that. I love that I'm at that spot where I'm able to do that.
I do feel like like one of my favorite comics is Carl Kerschel's The Abominable Charles Christopher, and it was like a web comic where he was doing basically a comic or like a strip every day, and he didn't really know what he was doing until like the day of. And I think, talking to him about it, he found it very creatively rewarding because it wasn't like it did, unless it like lacked the predestination that like a script would have or
Exactly.
something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I have the same thing. Yeah, I feel the same way. Where each day I kind of have a general sense of what is going to happen in the story, but I can kind of find new things too. And often when you have a full script and you have the whole story worked out, and you make sure everything works and it's all going to click ahead of time with plotting and scripting and everything. By the time you actually get to drawing the book, it's like you've already told the story, and then it can be like real drudgery where you're just sort of putting lines on paper, and you're just executing something you've already done all the work for, and you've already told the story in your head and written it out. So you kind of lose the excitement and energy for it that you keep if you don't work everything out so far in advance. So I'm really enjoying that aspect of it as well. And I've done enough. I feel like I've told enough stories and done enough comics now where I have a general sense of how to make things work. So even if I kind of start to veer off path, I kind of can pull it back and make it all work. Hopefully, in the end, we'll see.
Yeah. No, I think that when you have that full script, not saying it doesn't work for everybody, but it's like you kind of turn something that's magical into something mechanical,
Yep.
and it's kind of interesting how that is. Although at the same time, I do feel like your laissez-faire, wayward approach to it has a certain contrast to your organization and scheduling side that probably drives you mad sometimes.
No, they probably both doing stuff like that probably keeps me insane. The balance,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a perfect contrast, and it's a good balance in your life.
So the last question I want to ask you is, you were at North Carolina Comic Con this past weekend, and granted, I do want to say that what I read this on this like panel recap was not, I wasn't at the panel, so I can't say it was completely true, but you talked apparently about how after the Terrifics ends and perhaps a Black Label project, you'll be pulling back from for hire work. Is that just like a schedule based move that that you're too busy with your creator own work to tackle for hire projects right now?
No, it's not really schedule. I think it's just where my heart is now. When you can do your own stories and your own worlds and you can control them, it's so much more rewarding than doing work for hire stuff that you. It's just harder to invest yourself in those the same way. And it was real exciting for me to write for Marvel and DC when I first started doing it. Because you grew up reading those characters, and I had such a love for those universes, um, and I really genuinely enjoyed working for both companies for as long as I did. But I kind of feel to a certain degree I've kind of got it out of my system now, and now I'm much more invested in my own stories and my own worlds. And so just creatively, it's kind of where I'm at. I'm just not, I feel like I've done that enough, and it just doesn't excite me the same way as it used to. And I'd much rather make up something new and fresh that I own and I control. And there's no bad blood between me and anyone at DC or Marvel or anything like that. It's just creatively where I'm at, and I'm also very lucky that my stuff's been successful enough in the last few years, and I can afford to do that too. So that's kind of always the dream, is to tell your own stories and your own things. And I'm at the point now where I can, so I'm just going to kind of embrace that and go with it for a while.
I do this is me being a complete amateur psychologist, but there was this one like I don't know like drawing that you had done that was an image of a lot of this stuff, most of the stuff you had done, and it had like Gus from Sweet Tooth, and it had like characters from Essex County, and et cetera, et cetera. And it was almost like there was a hierarchy in the image where it's like it shows like your creator owned characters are all in their full form, and then there's like some ones that are comics underneath. They're just like they're holding the comics that are stories, like the Marvel and DC stuff. And it was weird. I don't know. I looked at that and I was just like, this feels like your own personal hierarchy of your own work, and that like your passion truly lies in your creator owned work.
Well, yeah, and it does, but that's, that doesn't mean to say when I was working on any of that stuff from or DC, I didn't put as much of myself into it as I could. It's just that I think when you own and control and create something yourself, you're just inherently it's more personal and to you, and it's like one of your children, and as fun as it is to go and write one of these great characters you grew up reading, it's just not the same feeling. I know the image you're talking about, and I think, to be honest, that was that was for a magazine cover for a catalog in Germany, and they kind of art directed that whole thing. So
Oh.
so you were wrong. Psychologist, they told me what to draw and how to draw it. But yeah, I could see how you could read that into that image. But I mean, yeah, my Kratos stuff, for everything from Essex County and Sweet Tooth to Black Hammer and all this stuff, and of course that means more to me than my run on Green Arrow or whatever, and that's just because I created it myself, and so of course it's more special to me.
Yeah, man, I really thought I was getting somewhere as an amateur psychologist. I guess I'm done.
But you can keep your part if you want. I don't know.
All right, Jeff. That is. Thank you so much for all this. That's all I have for you. This was great. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Jeff Lemire. You can find him on Twitter at Jeff Lemire, on his blog at jefflemire.blogspot.com, and in his comics Black Hammer, Gideon Falls, and a sea of other incredible titles like Sweet Tooth and Essex County. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support the show, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find the show on social media by liking it on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, following it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, TJ Dali, Dave Slusher, Kieran Mark Antonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Greg Lockard, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Kent Heidelman, Philip Sevi, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Paletto, Dylan Campbell, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nielsen, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Mike Gillis, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Dan Guarino, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Henning Allers, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, Darren Neely, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Phil Knoll, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from their album Volmilch opens the show. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.